settle on the land. He was the first person that we think actually lived here, was Mindert Hermans. Most of the deeds refer to Robert Sanders as living in New York, so that was where his primary residence was. He was just the landowner. I have read in some places that the mill was owned by Hermans, some by Sanders. There seems to be some dispute, but we do know that by 1699 there was a mill. And so that's pretty much all that happens pre-1700s. So now we have, this is a map from obviously the end of the century, but you can sort of see the waterfront in its sort of original state before there's been any shaping. Here's Call Rock. Right here is the mouth of the Fallkill, and Livingston's store. And so really where we're gonna start right here is at Upper Landing. In 1710, Colonel Leonard Lewis buys the area and builds his home on Snake Hill, which is that big hill right behind it. Slang Cliff is what it's called in Dutch. And he leaves the property to his family when he dies in 1730. In 1755, Martin Hoffman takes over the mill in Upper Landing, and he operates a sawmill and stores. By 1757, he builds a dock to encourage ships to dock at his mill, as opposed to any other place along the waterfront. By 1772, the docks are purchased by John Schenck, who becomes a commissary officer in the Continental Army and turns the Upper Landing site into a supply depot for the Hudson Valley and Poughkeepsie. This was sort of major move that really heightened the importance of the site itself and the area in general, because now you've got goods and services coming and going in relation to the war effort. In 1778, it's sold to Walter Livingston. And in 1789, the Hoffman House is built as a residence and offices for the mill, and that's still standing. In 1796, it's sold to Robert Livingston. This is another name that you're going to see over and over again. It should be noted that the Livingstons, as the case with most if not all of the wealthy landowners at the time, were slaveholders. And this was certainly a factor in their ability to acquire wealth and power and influence. It is very likely that the Upper Landing dock was the port of entry in our area for many trafficked Africans. And it's also clear that many of the Livingstons enslaved people worked on the docks as well. So that's a part of that history also. So now we're going to move down a little bit to the next sort of major site on the waterfront in this early time period, and that's the Union Store, which is also the call note of the Union Store Landing, which is basically where Call Rock Park is now, that's sort of underneath the Mid-Hudson Bridge. So the Union Store, it was, anyway, oh, sorry about that. But the Union Store was one of the main roads that extended down to the river. Main Street did not go down to the river yet. So Union Store, which sort of wound down around, it hit at this point, which was the Union Store Landing. And George Evertson was deeded the land from Gilbert Livingston in 1795. And he's the one that started the Union Store. This right here is just a copy of one of the deeds that we have in the library. It is the deed between Gilbert Livingston and George Evertson that we have in one of our boxes of historical documents. So here's a portrait of George Evertson. He ran the dock and shipyard at the waterfront and was one of the very first general stores trading in goods and services that came up on the river and sending things back out that like the lumber and other things that were being exported from the area. The Union Street, as I said, is named for his store, which was the original termination point when the Mid-Hudson Bridge came through, and then also the arterials. Obviously, that road got cut off and just sort of ended in a weird way, but it used to go all the way down to the water, and it was one of the earliest roads in the city. There we are. So yeah, here's my map. So here you've got Mill Street, which was the other one that goes right down to the mouth of the Fallkill. And then you've got another little road to Call Rock, which doesn't really exist anymore. And then Union Store down here. And here's the Union Street kind of curving around, going back into there. One of the really big industries in this early period was the shipyards and general freighting. So they were building ships in a lot of these places down here. This is sort of lower landing area. This right here would be what we call the De Laval property right now. And so you've got your shipyard road coming down, you got shipyard. So they were building ships, and then they were also freighting mostly lumber at this point, but also some crops from the farming, the local farming. Early 19th century, this is a big part of the area, the shipbuilding. It kind of peters out after that. But before it does, we have a period where Poughkeepsie was a continental Navy shipyard. This is just an example of one of the frigates that would have been built here. But this was Poughkeepsie's first real boom industry. It attracts new residents, mostly up from the city, and attention from the emerging leaders in the war effort. They picked Poughkeepsie because the location was pretty ideal. It was far enough north to be safe from the British. And it was selected to build 2 of 13 frigates that were authorized by Congress to be built. The shipyard was most likely, go back here, they're pretty sure that this shipyard is referencing the Continental Navy shipyard, although I've seen some other people say that maybe it was down here, but I think that that's the most likely spot for it. Construction would have happened in a lot of different places. They were building these ships, but they were also building fire rafts here, which were basically what it sounds like, boats that you set on fire and set onto the river to act as sort of stopgaps of people trying to come up the water. And they also rigged old boats that were no longer seaworthy and put them in shallower channels so that if you didn't know where they were, a British boat might come and hit them and it could stop them that way. There was a lot of fear that the British would advance in order to destroy the ships being built. And the concern at home was that there was no funds, which is a theme that you see throughout the war, of people not being paid, money being a problem, continental money not being accepted. The carpenters went on strike several times trying to get paid for their work. And, you know, the ships did get completed. They were completed in the winter of 1776, but unfortunately, they were quickly destroyed at the defense of Fort Montgomery in 1777. Ultimately, they were burned to prevent seizure by the British, and the battle was lost. They were never fully armed or sent to sea. So they'd been kind of pushed down there to help with an invasion that was coming up. And when they saw that they were losing, they just burned them right to the ground rather than give 2 perfectly good ships to the British. So not much of a noble end to that endeavor, but it was one of the big things that really put Poughkeepsie on the map early on in our nascent country. And so that's pretty much it for the 18th century. So we're going to move on to the real meat of this, which is 1800 to 1899. And right here, this is a map from 1834, and you can kind of see how different the waterfront already looks. You see edges being squared off in places, and there's just a lot more action down here, a lot more buildings all over the place, a lot more populous stuff happening. The invention of the steam engine is really going to change things for the Poughkeepsie waterfront, as it does for the rest of the world. So the very first thing that really becomes a big deal, and this, you know, happens a little bit before the turn of the century, but the ferries become a really big deal. So Anthony Yelverton is believed to operate the first ferry prior to the Revolutionary War. The first ferries were rowed by enslaved people. And there's a cemetery in Highland that is believed to be a burial ground for these men and women, the people of Anthony Yelverton. I know that Joan Kelly has been doing a lot of work around that, trying to get them a little more recognition for the part that they played in our history. Anthony Yelverton was formerly of Poughkeepsie. He crossed the river to Highland in 1754 and is believed to have started the first ferry crossing after settling there. There is little documentation about the early ferries, but it is likely that several operated in Poughkeepsie. And we know that there was this one, and there was at least another one down that went from like sort of South Poughkeepsie to Milton, because there was a town called Milton's Landing that changed its name to Camelot sometime, I think, in the late 19th century. But so we know there were several ferries running back and forth, but this one at Upper Landing was sort of the major one and one of the earliest ones. The first mention of a regular ferry crossing that I could find was in the Country Journal in 1793. And by the early 1800s, the ferries were powered by horses on treadmills until the use of steam power took over for that. And they operated regularly from Highland and Poughkeepsie until 1931 after the completion of the bridge. So this was a pretty long-lived industry. And this ad I have over here is just an ad for a stolen horse that's mentioning that it was supposed to have been ferried across at Baker's Ferry in Poughkeepsie. This was the first mention that I could find in the paper. I'm sure that there are more, but keyword searching can be a little dicey for the older papers. So, and the papers don't, I think 1787 is the earliest paper that we have. So, but so as you can see, around for a long time. This is just an illustration of what the horse-powered ferries looked like. They kind of walked and they had a paddle wheel and they had basically a treadmill here. And here you can see the line on this 1830 and 40 map, 34 map from Highland to Poughkeepsie and Upper Landing, and you have your ferry dock right here, basically right along the line of where the bridge later goes. So back over to Upper Landing. It's sold by Robert Livingston in 1800 to Martin Isaac and Robert Hoffman, who are three brothers. They are relatives of the earlier Martin Hoffman, who had made a lot of improvements at the site originally, even though he owned it for a short period of time. He'd built a lot of the warehouses and the mills down there. They owned their own sloop, which sailed regularly to New York, moving both people and goods. And here's just a couple advertisements from the paper of some of the things that they were selling from their storefronts down there, and advertisements for the boat that's going back and forth, the Sloop Mary. This is also around the time that you really start to hear the term Upper Landing being used. Before that, it was usually just called Livingston Store, or someone, you know, named after the people that were there. But that term Upper Landing comes into wide use at this point. I think you can see it on here somewhere. Yeah, right here, the mills at Upper Landing. Yeah, this is just, I just wanted to point some of the words on this. Oh. Sorry, my computer's a little frozen. Okay, there we go. Some of the funnier words on here. So we have Slang Clip, which is that hill I mentioned before, Snake Hill. Why it was named that? Presumably there were snakes. And then down here we have Poughkeepsie, which is a made-up word that the 19th century folks really like to use. They told themselves that it was an indigenous phrase meaning safe harbor, and was used to refer to the mouth of the Fallkill. Later on, there is a pretty well-known boat club that names themselves Poughkeepsie and works out of this area. There's no evidence that this was ever a word in any indigenous language. So I don't know if there's any real truth to it, but it's on the maps a lot. So I thought I'd just point out what that means. All right, and so here we've got a couple different advertisements and notices in the paper about the various businesses that were operating. So we've got James Reynolds and Aaron Innes, who were purchasing a portion of the Upper Landing businesses from the Hoffmans in 1816. All of these names will dominate the Upper Landing for the next 80 years or so. These businesses stay in place. The Arnold family, they settle in, they do both lumber and furniture, right down there on the mouth of the Fallkill. And then up here, we've got Innes and Sherman and Wilkinson running a sloop and a towboat. And a towboat is just, usually if there was a steamboat that was carrying freight, they would have a towboat for passengers behind it. So some steamboats just carried passengers and some had freight and then another towboat behind them for passengers. But there were still sloops running well into the time of the steamboats, because I assume it was a cheaper, slower form of travel. So you see them both for quite some time coming in and out of these ports. So now we'll move on to the Reynolds family, who really established themselves early on at Upper Landing and became a real fixture. This is a picture from our collection. You can see this says Falkhill Store right here. Here's the Hoffman House right here. This was a storehouse. This was a storehouse erected by Reynolds and Innes. Innes lived at the Hoffman House and Reynolds in the house pictured nearby. By 1827, Reynolds and Innes had taken over the property at Upper Landing and are also running the ferry. And here's just several different ads from various time periods around that mid-century showing the wide variety of goods that they were selling here. So we've got salt and butter and cement and flour and mackerel and hams. You know, general stores really covered it all during this time period. And since they were right there where all the boats were coming in, they had access to all the goods. This is from a little bit later in the century, but this is a ledger that we have in our collection from the Reynolds General Store. This was from W.W. Reynolds, and it's mostly just his accounting records, primarily relating to vendors and suppliers, who owes what, who got what, balance to be paid. Just thought it was really cool. I think we have two of these, one from WW and one from WT, who was another generation later in the Reynolds family. Okay, so back to sort of the mid area. So this is the first time we start to see Main Street and the Main Street dock really become a thing, because originally Main Street stopped basically at Market Street. That was, you know, for most of the 18th century, that was just sort of up there, and then you had Mill and Union coming down to the water. But around 1800, they pull Main Street all the way down to the water, and then we get William Davies' store in the Main Street dock. Davies purchased a large swath of land on the waterfront around 1798, where he owned and operated a dock, store, and freighting company. This became known as the Main Street dock when the street was extended down to the waterfront. This is now Warriors Park, that area. This will eventually become the main and busiest port along the waterfront. Things sort of consolidate there as the century goes on. It was later sold to Samuel Pine, who is the person that Pine Street is named after, and later Stephen Pardee. In 1815, William Davies is one of the 5 largest taxpayers in Poughkeepsie, along with George Evertson of Union Store fame. So that really shows that all of the money is being generated by these waterfront properties and by the industries that are happening down there, even as early as 1815. And you can see here's your original waterfront, and they kind of fill this in pretty early on and put some fill there for his dock and extend the land a bit. You know, there's no natural waterfront in Poughkeepsie anymore. Anything you see there has been filled in the 19th century for all these various industries and purposes. So now we'll talk about the steamboats. In 1814, Poughkeepsie becomes the first steamboat terminal between New York and Albany. The first boat was the Firefly, and here's a little ad for it right there from 1814. It was the smallest of the Fulton and Livingston fleet, and it was docked at Main Street. This is where it came and went. So this really increased the importance of the Main Street dock, although most of the freighting industry was still happening in the upper and lower landings or Union Store. Sloops typically ran to New York about once a week or once every other week, but the steamboats were running twice or even 3 times a week, connecting cities and towns along the Hudson and facilitating much greater travel, both to and from the city, but also all of the other, you know, towns along the waterfront, Newburgh, Beacon, Hudson, you know, all these areas that had been a lot harder to get to. Suddenly we had steamboats going 3 times a week, and people could move around a lot more easily. There's just a couple advertisements for some of the various steam and towboats. This one right here is, let's see, Conklin and Hewitt. And then over here, we've got Captain Dean going from Union Street, Union Landing. So this was a big business. They were carrying both freight and passengers, and this was a lot of what was happening down there. All right. So the whaling industry was another sort of, it's a well-known industry for Poughkeepsie, although it was fairly short-lived. In the 1830s, whaling was a real boom industry, and all of the wealthy industrialists in Poughkeepsie, they wanted a piece. They could see that places like New Bedford and even Hudson were really doing well in the whaling industry, and they wanted to be a part of that. Between 1832 and 1833, these two separate companies were formed, the Poughkeepsie Whaling Company and the Duchess Whaling Company. And here's just where they were located. Poughkeepsie Whaling Company is down here over by Main Street, whereas Duchess Whaling Dock is sort of up here above Upper Landing and Slang Cliff Hill. I'll talk a little bit about whaling. So the people that got into this industry were, our most prominent capitalists, our most prominent industrialists: Matthew Vassar, James Hooker, Alexander Coffin, Nathaniel Talmadge. The companies did employ locals, so they were, job creators, but most of the skilled positions, the real, highly paid sailors and the whalers, they brought those guys in from New Bedford. I guess they just didn't trust that we were seaworthy enough around here. The very first ship was the Vermont, and it sailed the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, returning in 1835 with $16,000 worth of oil. Whale oil was used for lamps, the ambergris for perfume, and the baleen for umbrellas and corset stays. It is rumored that the captain of the Vermont was killed in a mutiny somewhere in the sort of South Atlantic, I believe. But he also may have just died. It's a rumor, but it seems very possible. Another ship, the Serco, was wrecked off the coast of Valparaiso, Chile, which was a great loss. And they only had, I think, maybe 5 or 6 ships to begin with. So losing one put a real big dent in it. And so by 1835, both the companies are operating out of the Northern Whaling Dock. They've sort of consolidated their efforts. It's a very messy, smelly industry. And I think that people weren't too keen on having it take up the whole waterfront. But also these companies were not doing well. And so by 1837, they're consolidating their business. So the whaling company sells its fleet and equipment to the Duchess Whaling Company. So at its height, the industry was the 5th largest sector of the economy. It was incredibly profitable, but it was also dangerous and risky, both for the men who worked the ships and for the men who gambled on the investing. It's very similar to a lot of the speculation you see going on during this sort of industrial boom period, where gentlemen with money started really speculating. Just, they would pick industries and they would just give it a shot and see if there was something to be made of it. Ultimately, this was not a successful industry for Poughkeepsie. Hudson had a little better success, but it was not much of a Hudson Valley industry. These ads right here just show a couple different bits and pieces about the whole story. You can see that Newburgh was also giving it a shot. I couldn't find much else about this happening, so I don't even know if they ever really did anything with it, but they were trying. This is the kind of thing that sort of sparked everyone's interest, was they saw that Hudson was really doing well and they wanted to compete. And so we understand several enterprising citizens have formed an association for the purpose of purchasing a ship and fitting her out for a whaling voyage. They expect to purchase the fine ship Cambris lately out of London packets. So it's just, they're speculating. The companies never really turn a profit. And by 1845, really nothing remained of the whaling industry but the name given to the docks, which are referred to as the whaling docks for the rest of the century. despite the fact that many other businesses that lasted much longer resided in those spots. You'll see on the map it says, and in the picture it says Whaling Docks over and over, and that's how they're referred to. And so that's really the longest lasting legacy of whaling was the name of the docks. And right here, there's just an investor's note, which I pulled, I believe, from the Platt book, just showing, how they were, getting people to sign on and get these subscriptions. And here's a little notice in the paper with some of these big guys, all big Poughkeepsie names: Hooker, Vassar, Paraclet Potter, Alexander Coffin, just trying to get something going. All right, and so yeah, here's another picture of the whaling dock. And right here in this 1834 map, you can see they have this filled in, although it didn't actually get filled in yet. Here and here, you can see the original line of the waterfront. And later on, you're going to have the ironworks will be here. There will be a glassworks, and this is sort of now where those Duchess 1 apartments are, just to get a sense of where we're at. All right, this is one of the real big ones that we had down there. The Vassar Brewery was a huge mainstay of the waterfront for many, many decades. In 1796, James Vassar immigrates from England and begins brewing beer sort of a bit east of the waterfront, sort of in the town of Poughkeepsie area near Manchester Bridge. Starts from growing barley and just brewing his own beer, but it was super popular. And so pretty soon he kind of abandoned farming to do this more full time. In 1803, the Vassar operation moves to the village. And by 1809, a brewery is opened on what is now Vassar Street. Actually where the sort of Canine Hackett, that was the original site of Matthew Vassar's brewery. In 1811, it is a fire destroys the brewery and kills James's oldest son, John Guy Vassar. In 1812, Matthew Vassar takes over the family business. As a young man, he had not been super interested, and he'd kind of wanted to do some other things. So his father had originally apprenticed him to a tanner, and he really hated that. So he ran away across the river. I believe I've heard he walked over the ice and spent some time in Bombville and Newburgh, where he worked for several shopkeepers. But he returns by 1810, and then when his older brother is killed, he really steps up and takes over the family business. So in between, when they were working on rebuilding the brewery, Matthew Vassar did have his brewery, or his, he had a bar in the basement of the third courthouse, I think. And the sort of apocryphal story is that he was the first person to bring oysters to Poughkeepsie, and it was a staple of his bar, the basement of the courthouse, was that you could get beer and oysters, and nobody else had done that before. So, but then they rebuild on Vassar Street and move back up. But soon enough, they got to move again because they really are doing so well that they need to expand their operations. And so in 1832, after a series of different partners, Matthew Vassar partners with his nephews, the John Guy's two sons, Matthew Vassar Jr. and John Guy Vassar. And then in 1836, they build this much, much larger building just north of the Main Street dock downtown because they want to be closer to the shipping industry. It flourishes. It is, for many years, is considered the largest brewery in the United States. And they're just producing, a huge amount of beer and other things too, sodas and soft drinks, but mostly English style ales. This here is just a map. This is from the 1887 Sanborn map, so you can get an idea. So here's Water Street right here, and the structure just kind of went from the street all the way down to the waterfront and had several different buildings. He also owns property across the street, which we'll see in a minute. So unfortunately, due to in part to an influx of new immigrants from Western Europe, the English style ales fall out of favor in favor of German lagers. And so by the turn of the 20th century, Vassar Brewery really is no more. However, as we all know, its success built Vassar College, which was founded by Matthew Vassar. And it also built the Vassar Brothers Hospital and the Vassar Institute and the Vassar Old Men's Home. The latter three all founded by Matthew Vassar Jr. and John Guy Vassar. And this is it right here down by the waterfront, these buildings right here. So yeah, so it did finally, run its course. And also Matthew Vassar never had children, so his nephews were his inheritors. But they built a lot in the town with this beer money. So, wow, one of the big things to point out in this 1834 map, the first time that we see this is this Van Cleek's Hotel right here by the steamboat dock. Before that, we really hadn't seen any hotels down here. They'd mostly been up by the corners of Market and Main, which was the main, surface road. This is the Van Cleek Hotel owned by Leonard Van Cleek. It will soon become known as the Exchange Hotel. It was built in 1834 when this substantial dock was built for the steamboats. This right here on the map. It is, clearly there's a lot more boat travel now, especially with these steamboats. And there's people that are more willing to come and go for short periods of time. So they're coming in on the steamboats. Maybe they spend the night at the hotel, they go back out again. It's just, shows the changing character of the waterfront. Right here is the C. Vassar's Brickyard. This was owned and operated by Matthew Vassar's uncle Charles, but he was not the businessman that Matthew Vassar was. So in 1837, Matthew takes over the business from him and runs it for quite some time. It is one of many brickyards that also you'll see down here over the years. Brickyards, coal, and lumber remained by the waterfront for quite some time. Back to Union Landing. There is still, in the very early part of the 19th century, you're still seeing some conglomeration of businesses down here by Union Store. And it remains part of the freighting industry for the early part of the century. But Upper Landing has really taken over as the main sort of commercial dock, and Main Street has really taken over as the main passenger dock due to the presence of the Fallkill, the mills, and all that stuff, and the ferries up there. So Union Landing's really falling out of favor as a port or as a point of entry for goods and services. And down at Lower Landing, we've got more towboats and steamboats, and that's basically all that's happening down here as well. Although we do have the Southwick Tannery, which was located here for many years, and then you've got your towboat. This one is run by Uriah Gregory. So in 1825, the Fulton and Livingston patent expires, which means steamboats suddenly become available to, the steam engine becomes available to everyone. So you see a real proliferation of other companies, whereas, for the first, decade or so, Fulton and Livingston really had a copyright and they had the monopoly on the steamboats, but now they're popping up all over the place because that patent has expired. So Uriah Gregory moves into this sort of Lower Landing dock, and he was operating the towboat Saratoga, which was a passenger barge pulled by a steamship carrying freight. And he's also running the steamboat, the Hudson, both out of Lower Landing at this point. Okay, now another big industry coming to the waterfront, and that is the Hudson River Railroad. Sort of a big deal. In the 1830s, Matthew Vassar and a bunch of wealthy industrialists first start pushing for a railroad, but they're wanting an east-west railroad that goes into Connecticut. But this effort was not undertaken very seriously. By 1841, though, they're developing the Harlem line, far east in Dutchess County on the north-south track. And this really starts to scare Vassar and all of these other gentlemen that are, have created all their industry along the waterfront, because they're afraid that if trains are coming in that far east, all of their businesses will be cut off from new commerce, and they'll be left out in the cold, really. They're worried about the winter freezes. When the ice freezes over, it can be hard for the boats to move back and forth. So they really start agitating to get a railroad that goes up and down along the Hudson River. They raised $3 million to support a charter of the Hudson River Railroad. And in 1849, the railroad is completed to Poughkeepsie. And right here, you can see this first advertisement in the paper about the car coming. By reference to our advertising columns, it'll be seen that the first regular train on the Hudson River Railroad will arrive here on Monday next at about 11 o'clock, and that from that time forward, 2 regular daily trains will arrive and leave at this place, 1 a.m. and the other p.m. So that's really going to be a huge sea change for everything. You know, now we're talking twice a day, not twice a week. You know, the steamboat was a leap forward, and this is another leap forward for both commerce and passenger travel. And then here's just a little cut, a wood cut of the riverfront. And now you can see the train kind of going in the background. You've got your Bass Brewery, you've got your steamboat, you still got sloops. But you can see how things are changing. And focus is going to shift again now that we've got the railroad in town. So at this point, the waterfront is, as you can see, an incredibly busy, bustling place of industry. The railroad has come through, and they've gotten their route along the river, meaning they don't have to relocate their businesses farther east. And now they have access to both the trains and the boats. And over here, you can see that this bay is still not quite filled in. And the waterfront line looks very different than it does right now. And you've got much greater room at the mouth of the Fallkill too, for boats to come in and out. So back up to Upper Landing again. What have we got here? So as you can see on this little map right here, Vassar has a couple warehouses. And then we've got AJ Coffin has a foundry, and that's new. The first mention I can find of his stove business is from 1834. He was also involved in the whaling venture. That's Alexander Coffin. He was a New York State senator, and he sat on the Poughkeepsie Village Board of Health. He died in 1868 and is buried at the Poughkeepsie Friends Ground. We also see Gifford, Sherman, and Innes over here running a dyewood factory. This will very shortly move down to be along the mouth of the Fallkill, this dyewood. And dyewood, if you're not sure, was pretty much exactly what it sounds like. They would take sort of exotic or strongly colored woods, and they would, soak them in boiling water and essentially make dyes for leather and clothes out of wood. And it was a pretty big industry in Poughkeepsie, and they did very well for a very long time making these dyes. We've got Dowdy and Wilkinson right here. They are running a freighting business. This article from 1954 right here shows an illustration of one of their ships. It was the Republic. It was built locally and later used as a passenger ship between New York and Poughkeepsie. And then eventually, I think this one right here talks about there was a fire that finally destroyed the building in 1891. And that was sort of the last of that, but it had been fading out since then anyway. Right here, we've got D. Arnold, the chair factory. In 1836, he's originally selling lumber, but by 1845, he's the owner of a grist mill, and he also owns the Hoffman House at Upper Landing, and he's running this chair factory, which sticks around for quite some time as well. Hold on. Okay. Right. So this map from 1887 shows how Gifford and Innes of the Dyewoods have moved, and they're taking over pretty much all the docks around the Fallkill mouth. Martin Hoffman's mill is now a dyewood factory. And right here, you can see it says piles of dyewoods because the Sanborn maps were letting you know what fire hazards were around. So they're giving some real good detail in here. And you can see, so all of the lumber was just piled up along here. And then you've got the mill over here and the Arnold factory right here. And a lot of the wood comes from Africa and South America because I guess they made the best dyes. Right here, you can start to really see the activity down at the Main Street dock. You've got Matthew Vassar's brewery going strong along here, along with his brickyard right here, which is now very conveniently located right by the depot. And then you're starting to see a bunch more stuff down here as well, and sort of building up along these roads to the east and west. We got more lumber yards. Here's DC Foster and Raymond Hodges. But as you can see from this landowner here, that William Davies still owns this land right by the Main Street dock. And they're still partial landowners, and they're, you know, renting out to some of these other organizations. Lumber continues to be a real big business. And now that we're in the height of the Industrial Revolution, coal is a pretty hot commodity as well. So you start seeing coal yards, which that's, you know, they'll start turning up. You see the names kind of change here and there, but the locations are the same. And coal and lumber yards will remain here until at least the end of this century in this area and other parts of the waterfront as well. So over here by the steamboat dock, we can see the Van Cleek's Hotel is now called the Exchange Hotel. And Vincent and Co are operating the steamboat, the Advocate. They own the property that owns the hotel, so it's kind of a one-stop shop. They own the steamboat and the hotel. And they're also heavily engaged in freighting. Around Call Rock, we still see mostly residences, but up here on Water Street, you're starting to see some more industry coming in. You've got the Chichester chair manufacturer right here. And this article over here, just sort of wanted to pull it out because one of the things that we don't talk about that much when we talk about all of this industrialization is the human cost. A lot of these factories were very dangerous, and there were no labor laws and there were no safety laws. And so here's just an article about a couple different guys getting pretty badly injured at their various factory jobs. 2 men employed in Mr. Chichester's chair factory were severely injured a few days since by some of the machinery. One of them, it is feared, will lose his hands. A third man, we learned, had his hand badly hurt since by the same piece of machinery. It must be a naughty piece of work, that. So maybe not taking it as seriously as they should be. But a little bit more about the Chichester factory. So this was another fairly big industry down there. It was established in 1846 by Samuel Chichester, born 1801 in Cairo, New York. It employed men working in the factory to create the chairs, and then women would at home do the caning. So they weren't actually working in the factory, but it was employing both men and women. The establishment of the railroads west of the Kingston provided access to new raw materials, and they established a second factory and a town in the Catskills. The town was named Chichester. I think there's still some remnants of it there, but I don't think it's a real viable town anymore. The factory on Front Street was later converted into a wheelbarrow factory and then row houses, and now is long gone. 1960s for the creation of the arterials. Okay, and now another big industry, the sort of mid-century, comes along and becomes a really big part of the waterfront, is the blast furnace. As the Industrial Revolution builds steam, the need for iron for manufacturing and building really increases intensely. And so this industry becomes a real significant part of the industry. The ore being smelted here was brought in from Sylvan Lake and fluxed with limestone. In 1848, William Bushnell purchased the Union Landing area, and he builds the first iron foundry on the waterfront. Pretty soon, Albert Tower is brought in to run the business. He will run this one, and he will also run another one that happens at Upper Landing called the Falk Hill Iron Works. Down on Lower Landing, we've got the tannery, which we know has been here since at least 1834 and continues, let's say, to the early 20th century. It's still going down there. And then we've got the rope works up here. So you're just, different factories, different manufacturing. It's all kind of congregating in these areas. You can see down here that this big bay, this is now the De Laval property that has not been filled in yet. So it's all just sort of, still the natural waterfront. Although that will soon start to change. Here we go. Okay. So in 1867, the northern waterfront around Upper Landing is largely the same as 1850. Most of the names that you see here are the same. We've got the Reynolds brothers, we've got Gifford, Sherman, and Innes, and Doughty and Wilkinson, the freighting company, has become Doughty, Cornell and Co. One new change you see is this Charles Murphy. He's operating an ice house, and he buys the shipyard over here at the whaling docks. He purchased it from the Finch shipyard, which built many notable schooners and steamboats. But Murphy really didn't do very much in terms of building shipbuilding. He ran lime kilns here, which makes sense because eventually this will become the Fallkill Iron Works as well. And he's got this ice house. And here is just a listing from the city directory showing that he lived on Albany Street, which is, right over here, sort of up close. Back at the Main Street dock, again, not a ton changing here. We've got the Reynolds Coal and Wood Yard. We've got the Hull Coal Yard and J. Hudley Coal and Lumber. So that's pretty much what's happening industry-wise down there. Vassar, of course, still going. But the big change down here that we start to see is the proliferation of hotels really clustered around the waterfront and the train station. So we have the Exchange Hotel in the 1830s, but now, and this is a listing of all of the hotels in Poughkeepsie in the 1867 directory, and all of these right here that I've marked with red arrows are on this sort of 3-block radius right here. You got the Exchange Hotel, there's another one here, there's one right here, one right here. And it just goes to show the difference in what we're seeing. And you're also seeing things shift more, associated with the railroad. But this lower Main Street area becomes a really sort of big hub for both, pleasure and business, because now you've got travelers passing through. I liked this little ad. I wanted to put it on here. It's a $50 purse because they're going to have a horse race on the ice in front of the Exchange Hotel. That I guess anyone can show up and bring their horse and ride. It's a mile heat, best 3 and 5, and you can watch it from the piazzas of the Exchange Hotel. This will give the ladies a chance to see a good race, as there are several fast horses here. I just really enjoyed that. Although the thought of racing horses on the ice just, I don't know. Doesn't seem safe. But just the idea of the way of the river being completely frozen over is interesting to me as well. Okay, and now we've got a new face on the horizon, and that is Fred Gilman's Call Rock Brewery. This brewery was established in 1861 on the tip of Call Rock in response to Matthew Vassar's success. As often happens with industries, you see some kind of copycats pop up here and there. In 1863, it's purchased by the Gilman family of Brooklyn. They operated out of this spot for over 80 years. They made pine ale, beer, cider, carbonated water, and soft drinks. And in later years, the building was used as a restaurant, which I imagine was a really lovely place to have a restaurant, overlooking the water up there. Good views. And so we go back down to the ironworks and that Bushnell blast furnace, which is in high gear at this point. Albert Tower is brought in to run it, as I mentioned before. Albert Tower had already amassed a fortune in the iron business in Ohio, so he was kind of the expert, sort of like a celebrity CEO of the time, where they brought him in to run this business. Um, and you can see just from what we saw in 1850 that there's a lot more happening down here, much more buildings, and he's got his residence right here. So Albert Tower was born 1817 in Paris, New York. Comes to Poughkeepsie in 1850. He operates this location and the Falco Iron Works at the Whale Docks. In 1875, they merge, and this one, known as the Lower Furnace, is abandoned sometime in the 1880s. If you've ever spent any time down in Call Rock Park, you can see the pylons and the various bits and pieces of the former docks and, you know, shoring up of the water along there. Most of that's probably going to be from the Poughkeepsie Iron Works, because there's not really much there in terms of industry afterwards. This is a painting by Johann Hermann Karmenke. This painting is from the Yale University Art Gallery, and it just gives a sort of nice, you know, Hudson River School style view of the foundry, which is right here, overlooking it from Call Rock, and, you know, sort of a pastoral example. I'm sure it was, you know, less bucolic than this when you've got all these factories pumping out steam and air pollution, but it just kind of helps, you know, visualize it a little bit more. All right, now the big guys, the ones that I owe everything to, at least the building that I work out of. The Adrian's Platco in 1867, you start to see them down on the southern waterfront here, just north of where the tannery is. John P. Adriance is born sorry, that's supposed to be 1825. Born in 1825 here in Poughkeepsie. He's educated here, but afterwards he moves to the city to work in the hardware business. In 1852, he partners with his brother-in-law Samuel Platt and Samuel Sears to form a wholesale hardware business, Sears, Adriance, and Platt. While they were in this business, Adriance and his father John become very interested in the mower and reaper business. They're inspired by the success of the 4-bush mower, and they start looking for a way to get into that business. So in 1855, they acquire the patent for the Manny mower, and they establish a factory in Worcester, Mass, because that's where they were based out of, or that's where John P. was based out of at the time. And so that's how they get started in the reaper business, but this is where they really flourish, and that is with the Buckeye. In 1857, Adrian buys the patent to Lewis Miller's Buckeye mower, which won the first prize at the mower and reaper trials in Syracuse. In 1859, Adrian moves the operation back to his hometown. And in 1863, Sears leaves the business, so it becomes Adrian's Platt & Co. The waterfront factory is built to accommodate the growing business and create more access to shipping routes. Unfortunately, the business thrives until 1913, but the Adrian's children were not interested in carrying on the business, so they sell to Moline Plow Co. And unfortunately, Moline Plow Co. Pretty quickly goes under because they lost a lot of money in World War I, selling equipment, I believe, to the Russians that they never got paid for, and so they go out of business. And then the factory sits empty for years until I believe the 30s when it burns down. 1939. I had it in my notes. Aside from the technical advances of the plow, which was a lighter and more efficient machine, one of the things that people really attribute to the Adrians' success is their very successful marketing materials. As you can see here, here's some examples of some of their illustrated catalogs. In 1870, they were the first farm machinery company to produce a full color catalog with these beautiful illustrations. All of these were taken from copies that we have in the local history room. We have a couple scrapbooks filled with the various catalogs over the years, and they really are very beautiful. Just rich color, beautiful illustrations, and it was really much as to say about the Eastman Business College is that a lot of these businesses, like it was really the marketing. They had innovative marketing, and it helped draw people to them in ways that other businesses hadn't. This just here is a picture of the factory puffing away. As you may know, the Adrian's Memorial Library building was the gift of John P. Adrian's 6 children, who donated the funds to build the library in the late 1890s, and named it in honor of John P. and Mary Ruth Van Plott. So that's our legacy. Lower Landing is still plugging along. Things haven't changed too much down here. I pulled up these two side by sides just so you could see the evolution of the waterfront. In 1867, we're squaring things up, and then it's really getting filled in by 1886. And we see a lot more land here where there hadn't been before. Charles Crook and James Collingwood are operating a propeller ship called the Sherman that runs twice a week to New York out of here. And it's still operating mostly as a freighting port. Okay, so now we're going to move to this 1874 map, which I really like. It doesn't have as much information as some of the other ones, but it is 3D, so I think it helps give you a better visualization of what's going on down here. One of the things that I really like about this map, as you can see, so we have the railroad bridge here, but it's 1874, and there is no railroad bridge yet. So this was kind of a wishful thinking that they put on here, I think. And as you can see, it sort of just peters into nothing right here. There's no tracks or anything. And obviously the design is not what the original final design will be, but they just kind of put it in there saying, this is what we're hoping to do. Right now, you can see right here, we've got the Falco Iron Works on the whale dock right up here. And then right down here is the Gifford, Sherman, and Innis Dyewood still going right here. On the Main Street dock, you can get a little bit of a fuller picture here. You can see here's the turntable for the railroad and the depot. Exchange Hotel is right here. This whole complex is the Vassar Brewery. Pretty extensive. Got the Exchange Hotel, you've got the Forbes Hotel right here, and some of the other businesses. The Swash Lemon Co. Blind Factory is right here. And then this right here is Call Rock, and this is probably Gilman's brewery right on there. Here's the Ironworks down on Union Landing. You can get a better sense of this. They're still kind of operating right down here. And here's sort of the circuitous path of Union Street as it went down here to the water. It's the picture of Adrian's Platte. And then down here to Crooks and Collingwood, and here you can see again the squaring off of the waterfront. Here's the tannery. There's Crooks and Collingwood right there. So let's talk a little bit more about the ironworks up here on the whaling dock. And on this 1886 map, you can also see that the railroad bridge is sort of intimated, but does not quite exist yet. So it's just a dotted line and a glint in someone's eye. Everyone's still, it's mostly pretty much the same. We've got the ironworks, we've got Gifford and Sherman still down here on the waterfront. We've got some freighting here, but not really too much going on. I just really like this picture. I think it's very evocative. This is right after the railroad bridge was completed. So we're looking north here, and there's the ironworks. You can see they have their own little railroad spur. You can see that that bay still isn't completely filled in at this point, although it will be by the end of the century. And just, gives a vibe of what the industrial waterfront really felt like back then. Down at the Main Street landing, here you can see everything's pretty much the same. You're getting more and more built out a little bit north of the railroad and around the railroad. Things along the waterfront aren't changing too much, although you can sort of see that there's not a whole lot going on down here where the old foundry was. Here's the same view looking south. Here's Matthew Vassar's Brewery right here. Here's the Exchange Hotel again. We've got a nice big dayliner right there, with a steamboat dock, and just very populated. You're seeing, and the waterfront has a completely different shape to it. It's, all straight edges, and wide boulevards you can walk along. And down here, you can see that there's not much left at the ironworks. Adrian's Platt's still going, Southwick's still going, and Collingwood's got a lumber and coal yard. We're going to talk just real quickly about the railroad bridge. It really obviously deserves its own talk. There's a lot more to it than what I'm going to get into. But since it's only tangential to the waterfront, we're just going to briefly touch on what happened to get it here. So after many years of scheming and raising funds, the wealthiest men in Poughkeepsie get their wish, and the railroad bridge is completed in 1889. For practical purposes, it does not have a huge effect on the waterfront, which was much more affected by the north-south railroads for obvious reasons. But its arrival is very symbolic of, the train sort of conquering the century, and the railroads really taking over for the water in terms of transportation and shipping. And it also, very hugely changes the look of, the bridge is a complete staple of our view of the waterfront. And it's something that I think everybody thinks of when they think of Poughkeepsie now. So that, that's a big sea change when you all of a sudden have this change in the landscape. As you can see in this postcard right here. And here you can see you've got some of your dayliners. Here's some of those warehouses. There's that Fallkill store. And the Dowdy freighting building. And right here would be the Innis Dyewoods, which is now it was also known as the piano factory, I believe, in the 20th century. It's now residential apartments. And look how much wider the creek is at this point. Just little things. Here's a view from across the river. This right here is the Brinkerhoff ferry. My Brinkerhoff ferry goes. Captain Brinkerhoff ran the ferry for quite some time. He built a beautiful old house on Hamilton Street that you should check out sometime, because it is said that he built it to resemble a ferry. I don't know if that's true or not. It does have a kind of boat-like look. It doesn't look like this ferry though. But he purchased the Poughkeepsie Transportation Company in 1878. And he really sort of puts the nail in the coffin of the upper landing as a port, because he pretty quickly moves the ferry dock to the Main Street dock. And at that point, the upper landing, there's no more ships coming or going to upper landing at that point. They're all sort of consolidated at the Main Street dock by 1879. And so there you go. I like this postcard from Adrian's Platt celebrating the bridge, because they really put themselves right in the foreground there. It's a very convenient location where you can really clearly read all the signs, but it's also just a nice postcard. Okay, so this 1891, this is taken from one of our ward maps. And as you can see, the details are much more intense on the ward maps than in some of the other maps. All these different colors indicate different materials. So this usually means wood. The red, the pink usually means brick, and it tells you the purposes of all of these things. And up here you've got your blast furnace of Fallkill Ironworks. This is the only one left at the waterfront at this point. And the iron industry is sort of waning in Poughkeepsie at this point. There's competition from the south and the west in the iron industry, and really it's becoming less of a factor in Poughkeepsie. But there is a new industry on the docks, and that is the glassworks. Here's just a picture, and as you can see, they're still referencing the whaling docks in this. And then this was published in like 1906. And it's just an image of the glassworks. They were started in 1881 to utilize the iron slag from the foundries using a technique that was patented in England. The Poughkeepsie Glassworks were the first successful continuously operating tank. So it was just when it was in season, it was just running all day long, and there was just people that worked all shifts, and that thing just kept going and going. And by 1897, they had 3 tanks that were continuously outputting 130,000 bottles a year. And here are just a couple images. These are bottles that we have in our collection. You know, they made bottles for just about everything in every local business. So you've got, you know, beer, obviously some prescription and druggist bottles, milk, soda, wine, brandies. They were doing it all, and they were producing for almost all the local businesses. They would just have their bottles manufactured at the glassworks. So by this point, the upper landing is largely fallen into disuse. As you can see on this map, it says burned July 23rd. This building is no more by this point in 1891. The transportation co is down at the Main Street dock. The Reynolds wholesale store has moved down to Main Street to be closer to the railroad stations. They're located in the parking lot. Innis and Co, they're still around, but they're not really doing so well anymore because chemical dyes have really risen in popularity and accessibility. And so the dyewood industry is dying off in favor of that. We do have this Fallkill knitting mill. I don't have any information that I could find about them, but so there are still some things operating down here, but it is not what it used to be. The Arnold Chair Company is still going. They managed to last until 1935 down here, despite labor disputes and competition from cheaper producers. And so they're one of the last industries that was really long lived down there that lasted into the 20th century. Yes, but what we do have that's new to Upper Landing is the Poughkeepsie Electric Light and Power Company. Electricity has come to Poughkeepsie. It's becoming a much bigger force in businesses and homes, and we need power plants. So this was built and then sold by the Reynolds in 1894. They finally sold the property, and the power company expands and consolidates into a name that you may recognize, Central Hudson Gas and Electric. By 1911, it has purchased the entirety of Upper Landing, and it still owns it to this day. We really see commerce as clustering around the train station and Main Street. You know, we're pushing down. This is our real center now. There's much less freighting happening down here, although we still have coal and lumber yards. But the dayliners and the ferries are the bulk of any shipping traffic that's happening at this point at the waterfront. Sorry. And down here by the train station, you can see that the Reynolds, they've abandoned Upper Landing, and they have moved their entire warehouse down to just across from the depot. You can see they have their own little spur here for the train, so that all their goods can be loaded right in. And this is the building that currently houses Mahoney's and, you know, various other businesses right there. And the depot was originally right here in what is now part of the parking lot. So by 1891, there's nothing left of the ironworks or anything else down here at the Union Landing. It's just some property owners, a few structures, but the business is basically gone down here, and it just sort of going feral. And so the very last thing I'm going to talk about down by the waterfront in this period of time is the De Laval Cream Separator Company. De Laval was a Swedish company that manufactured machines that separated creams from milk via centrifuge. It was invented by Dr. Gustav De Laval. In 1892, they built a U.S. manufacturing site on the banks of the Hudson River, south of Lower Landing. It was the very first factory in Poughkeepsie to be powered by electricity using a turbine engine. And the machine on site manufactured most of the tools that they used to make the separators. So they were really a one-stop shop. They were making their own machines to make their machines. It initially employed 50 men, but grew as the business took off. So here's just a little comparison of what De Laval looked like in 1900 and what they looked like in 1948. You can see it really took over a good chunk of the waterfront. For much of the 20th century, De Laval, later called Alpha Laval, was a major employer in Poughkeepsie, and they expanded into other products, mostly industrial, although they did design a cocktail mixer, which I'm really curious to see how that worked. It seems fun, a mechanical cocktail mixer. In 1964, the manufacturing moved east to the town of Poughkeepsie, and by 1990, the company had left Poughkeepsie altogether, although it still exists as a subsidiary of Tetra Laval. All right, and we're just gonna end on a little bit of a sad note, but you know, change comes for all of us. By 1898, the Exchange Hotel had really fallen into disrepair. It had always been owned by the transportation companies that owned the dock. And in the 1890s, the Central Hudson Steamboat Company decided that it was no longer worth it to invest in the property, which had become somewhat dilapidated and was no longer being operated as a hotel. So soon after this photo was taken, the building was torn down. You can see there's an advertisement here where they're auctioning off wood, brick, stone, etc. from the Exchange Hotel. So they sold every bit of it. And so soon after, they built a ferry station at that spot. And that was a sort of emblematic of the sort of rise and fall of the industry in the waterfront, is this hotel, which comes up with the beginning, and as we're petering into the 20th century and manufacturing stops being so important, the hotel comes down. And if I ever get to the next part, we can talk about the 20th century after that and all the stuff that happens down there. So just very quickly, I want to talk about some of my sources. Like I mentioned, most of this was from the maps in our collection and the archives from the newspaper. But I also want to definitely shout out the Upper Landing Park website, which was an amazing resource. If you're interested in more in-depth history of that site in particular, they really have an incredible history on there. There's timelines, there's images. It's really well done. I highly recommend it. We also have a thesis paper from a master student about the whaling industry, which, as far as I know, is one of the only things that has been written about the whaling industry in Poughkeepsie in any sort of, to any extent. So I looked into that a bit. Tony Musso's column on the De Laval separator helped me out a lot. A couple other things. Edmund Platt's book was a big one too, and we've got copies of that at the library if you're interested. And I bet you can find them for sale every now and then, maybe at the library bookstore, because copies come and go. It was published in 1906, and so it only covers up to that point, but it's a pretty extensive history of Poughkeepsie that, if you're curious, is a good resource. And that is it. I'm just going to leave this slide up with my contact information, and I don't know if you guys have questions, if anyone has any thoughts and they want to share anything I got
Thank you,
wrong,
Kira.
that you want to correct.
Thank you. So if anybody has questions, they can either chat and say they would like to ask a question, or they can unmute themselves, and we'll take a question one at a time. So Kira, my mom used Adrian's for many history. She was a local historian. So your library is very amazing when it comes to local history. If somebody's interested in getting some more information, they can email you easily.
Yes, absolutely. I've got my contact information up right here. If you ever have any local history questions, please feel free to shoot me an email, or we can make an appointment. You can come in, look around, see what we got. It's a pretty good collection. It's not, it's never comprehensive. There's always gaps that we wish we had more things from. But in terms of local public libraries, it's a fairly extensive local history collection with a lot of primary source materials, as well as secondary source materials. So feel free to come visit me anytime.
So Tom Laprie is asking, when did the North South, oops, it's getting lots of chats here. When did the North-South Railroad first arrive on the waterfront?
1849.
Okay, and a lot of people are saying wonderful lecture, so we applaud you.
Thank you.
It's very interesting to put the pieces together and how things change, and the industrial coming in and then the bridge being built and how it changes even more.
Yeah.
So anybody else with questions? So I would like to say this to you guys. First off, we want to give Kira a big round of applause for being here tonight. And if you ever get a chance, Adrian's Library is an amazing source. The other thing is we have this Great Connector series every month. So we would like to keep it going and keep our programs going. So if you guys are interested, go to our walkway site. Oh, we have another question. How does the Hudson River Railroad tie in with New York Central and Hudson River Railroad, NYCHRR?
They merge. The Hudson River Railroad is the first thing to come through. I believe the New York Central is the one that extends it further out, to Albany and places beyond. And at some point, I think by 1850 or 1860, the two railroads merge, and that's why it becomes NYCHHR. And then eventually it just becomes NYC. And then eventually.
Another question. Is there any record of any archaeological digs that happened at the Upper Landing?
I think so. I know that on the Upper Landing website, they mention having found some indigenous artifacts along the waterfront. So I think that they must have had some digs done. I would check that website out for more detail because I know that they've got some pictures of things, but I didn't read it specifically about digs. But I assume that that's how they came across those things when they were probably putting the park together and becoming a nonprofit. But yeah, other than that, I don't know of any specifics.
Okay. So I would like to say to you guys that we have this event called the Great Connector Series every month. So next month, we're having something on the River Keepers, which is going to be interesting. Carrie, you should buzz in for that one.
Yeah, that
here's
sounds
another
great.
question. Gosh, you're getting lots of questions now. And how do the railroads tie in with the ferries?
In what sense? I mean,
Richard, do you mean the timing?
I'm sure that they did have things timed out, yeah, so that the ferries would come whenever the trains would come.
Right.
But and I know that in Beacon they had a railroad ferry. That's apparently what Long Dock Park was originally, which was a surprise to me because I'd never even heard of such a thing. But I don't think we had anything like that here, which is why they wanted the bridge.
So Ish Martinez is asking, how much was Poughkeepsie affected by immigration in the 1890s?
Well, I mean, the immigration, they came to build the bridge and the railroads. Like a lot of the immigration, it was originally the Irish came to build the railroads, I think, in like the 1840s, 1850s. And then the Italians came to build the walkway, I think, or maybe it was the Italians came to build the Mid-Hudson Bridge, but there was definitely.
Well, I can buzz in on that one.
Yeah.
My mom did a lot of book history on walkway over the Hudson. Yes, the Italian families were brought in, and it's the Pisanis, the Valentinos. She was showing me newspaper articles. A lot of the Italian families that came have stayed in Highland. So it's very interesting to see.
But yeah, no, definitely these industries were bringing in a lot of immigration to the area, which changed the character. And there is another local history book called Natives and Newcomers. The author, I can't think of his name off the top of my head, but it's all about immigration into Poughkeepsie in the 19th century, and the various waves that came through, and what brought them here and what kept them here, and how it changed the character of the city. Obviously, the Little Italy area kind of, I mean, it sort of already existed. It was an immigrant community before the Italians came through, but they changed the character of it, and made it their own when they came in. So it definitely, as immigration always does, changes the city, brings new food and music and culture. which, for all of us, it's always a positive.
Any other questions? Well, if not, I would ask you to please visit the Adrian's website and also the Walkway website and Upper Landing website.
Yes.
Walkway will give you a plethora of events. They're coming in 2022. They're amazing. So always keep an eye open for that and become a member of the Walkway. We have these great programs to help out the community. So you can join as a membership and get discounts to paying events and Walkway at nights and everything. So I thank you again, Kira. And thank you to our guests that came today. I think I've learned a lot, actually. It's amazing.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. And I'll definitely have to check out that one next month. That sounds good.
Yeah, definitely. It's up on the calendar, Ray. I'll have information out on social in about a week about that. So everybody have a great, safe, warm evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next month.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye. Bye, Richard.